The dusty streets of Redemption fell silent as three gunmen strode toward the modest ranch at the edge of town. Word had spread that the old widow McAllister was sitting on a fortune in gold, left behind by her prospector husband. She was alone now, gray-haired and frail-looking, an easy target for men who made their living preying on the weak. The youngest of the trio smirked as they approached her porch where she sat in her rocking chair, seemingly oblivious to the danger walking her way. They'd done this before, intimidate, threaten, take what they wanted. But what they didn't know, what nobody in Redemption knew, was that before Eleanor McAllister became a widow, before she was a wife, she had another name. A name whispered in saloons from Dodge City to Tombstone. A name that once made grown men reach for their guns or run for their lives. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Redemption, a town that had seen better days. Once a thriving stop along the cattle trail, it had dwindled to a collection of weathered buildings and fading dreams. At the edge of town, where the last structures gave way to open prairie, stood the McAllister Ranch, a modest house with a sagging porch and a barn that had seen too many winters. Eleanor McAllister sat in a rocking chair, much as she did every afternoon, her weathered hands working at some mending in her lap. To anyone passing by, she looked like what she was supposed to be, a widow in her 60s, worn down by hard years and harder losses. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her black mourning dress had faded to a dusty charcoal. The lines on her face told stories of sun and sorrow, and her shoulders had the slight hunch of someone who'd carried too many burdens. But her eyes were different, sharp and clear as mountain ice. They tracked the three riders approaching from town with the casual awareness of a hawk watching field mice. The Dalton brothers and their cousin, Jake Morrison, had ridden into Redemption 2 days prior. They were the kind of men who brought trouble like dogs brought fleas, inevitable and irritating. The oldest, Frank Dalton, was a bull of a man with a scar that split his left eyebrow and a reputation for cruelty that preceded him by several territories. His younger brother, Roy, was quicker with a gun but slower in the head, content to follow Frank's lead into whatever mayhem presented itself. Jake Morrison rounded out the trio, a lean rattlesnake of a man who fancied himself a genuine gunfighter, with his pearl-handled Colts worn low on his hips. They'd spent their time in town asking questions, buying drinks, and listening to loose tongues wag about the widow at the edge of town. Old Thomas McAllister had struck it rich up in the hills before he died, folks said. Must have left his widow comfortable. They speculated. A woman alone with money, practically an invitation. Eleanor watched them come, her hands never stopping their steady work with needle and thread. She'd known they were coming since they rode into town. She'd seen their kind before, seen hundreds of them over the years. Men who thought guns and meanness made them dangerous. Men who never looked past the surface of things. The rocking chair creaked its steady rhythm as the three men dismounted at her fence. Frank Dalton took the lead, as he always did, his boots heavy on the hard-packed earth as he approached. Roy and Jake flanked him, hands hovering near their weapons in what they probably thought was an intimidating display. "Afternoon, Mrs. McAllister," Frank called out, his voice carrying false friendliness like a snake wearing a smile. "Fine day, ain't it?" Eleanor's needle paused for just a moment before continuing its work. "Fine enough," she replied, her voice carrying the rasp of age and desert wind. "Though I expect it's about to turn." Frank chuckled, glancing at his companions. "Now why would you say that, ma'am? We're just here for a friendly visit." "Men like you don't make friendly visits," Eleanor said, her eyes never leaving her mending. "You want something, and you think I'm too old and too alone to stop you from taking it." The false friendliness slipped from Frank's face like a discarded mask. "Smart woman. That'll make this easier. We know your husband left you sitting pretty. We're here for that gold he found up in the hills." "There is no gold," Eleanor said simply. Roy Dalton spat into the dirt. "Don't lie to us, old woman. Everybody in town knows Thomas struck it rich before he passed. Thomas found iron pyrite." Eleanor continued, her voice patient, as if explaining something to slow children. Fool's gold. He thought he was rich for about a week before the assayer told him the truth. It broke his heart more than any disease could. He died 6 months later, poor but hopeful. Jake Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun. You expect us to believe that? I don't expect anything from you except trouble, Eleanor said, finally looking up from her mending. Her eyes met Jake's, and something in that gaze made him shift uncomfortably. But I'm telling you the truth. There's nothing here worth dying for. Frank laughed, but it was an ugly sound. Ain't us that'll be doing the dying, old woman. Way I see it, you got 2 choices. You can tell us where the gold is, or we can tear this place apart looking for it. And you, well, accidents happen to old ladies living alone. Eleanor set down her mending with careful deliberation, her movements slow and measured. She placed her hands on the arms of her rocking chair, and for the first time, the 3 men noticed the twin holsters hanging from the chair's sides, mostly hidden by her skirts. There's a third choice, she said quietly. 27 years earlier, the name Ella Quick Draw Quinn had been spoken with respect and fear throughout the Western Territories. She'd been 18 when she first strapped on her father's guns after he was murdered by claim jumpers. She'd been 19 when she tracked down all 4 of them and left them for the crows. By 20, she'd killed 7 men in fair fights, each one faster than the last, each one certain that a woman, even one with a reputation, couldn't possibly be as good as the stories said. They'd all been wrong. Ella Quinn had a gift, the kind that couldn't be taught or learned, only born into the muscles and nerves and instincts. Her draw was liquid lightning, faster than thought, smoother than silk sliding off satin. She could put 3 bullets through a silver dollar at 20 paces before it hit the ground after being tossed. She once outdrew 2 gunfighters simultaneously in Abilene, killing both before either cleared leather. But more than speed, Ella had something most gunfighters lacked: wisdom. She knew when to draw and when to walk away. She knew that reputation could kill you as surely as a bullet, because there was always someone faster or luckier or more desperate. She knew that the gunfighter's life had only one ending, written in Boot Hill dirt and forgotten within a season. So at 23, after the shooting in El Paso that left 3 men dead and her with a bullet crease across her ribs, Ella Quinn disappeared. She rode east instead of west, changed her name, and found a quiet town where nobody knew her face or her story. She met Thomas McAllister, a gentle man with prospector dreams and kind eyes, and she let Ella Quinn die so Eleanor McAllister could live. For 27 years, she'd kept those guns cleaned and oiled, hidden away but never forgotten. Thomas had known, of course. She'd told him everything on their wedding night, expecting him to ride away. Instead, he'd held her and told her that everyone deserved a second life, a chance to be more than their worst moments. He'd loved her for who she was, not who she'd been, and she'd loved him for seeing the difference. Now Thomas was 3 months in the ground, and the world had sent her a reminder that some things, once learned, were never truly forgotten. Eleanor's hands moved to the pistols at her sides, drawing them out with the casual ease of someone picking up a familiar tool. They were Colt .45 peacekeepers, the grips worn smooth by years of practice and use, the metal still gleaming with careful maintenance. She held them loosely, pointed at the ground, unthreatening but ready. Frank Dalton's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the guns, but his confidence didn't waver. An old woman with pistols was still just an old woman. "You planning to shoot us, Grandma?" he sneered. "You probably can't even lift those things." "I'm planning to give you a chance," Eleanor said calmly. "A chance to turn around, mount up, and ride out of redemption. Tell everyone in town that the widow has nothing worth taking. Go find someone else to rob." Roy Dalton laughed. "You're crazy, old woman. There's 3 of us and 1 of you. You ain't fast enough, even if you could shoot straight." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a ghost of who she used to be. "Speed isn't everything," she said. "But since you brought it up, how fast do you think you are, boy?" Jake Morrison's pride couldn't let that pass. He was the gun hand of the group, the one who practiced his draw in every town they passed through, the one who'd killed 5 men in gunfights and thought himself the next Wild Bill Hickok. "Faster than you'll ever be," he said, his hands hovering over his pearl-handled Colts. "Lady, I'm giving you one last chance to put those guns down before someone gets hurt." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Then she spoke, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, something hard and cold as winter steel. "When I was younger, men came to test me regular. Every town had someone who thought they were fast, thought they were the one who'd finally put down Quinn. You know what I learned from all those men?" The 3 outlaws exchanged glances, confusion mixing with their growing unease. The ones who talked about how fast they were always the slowest when it counted. The moment stretched like hot taffy, thick and slow. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and shadow. A dust devil spun lazy circles down the main street of Redemption, half a mile away. Somewhere a crow called out, harsh and mocking. Frank Dalton's hand moved first. He was reaching for his gun, confident in the arithmetic of violence. 3 against 1, men against woman, young against old. His fingers had just brushed the grip of his Remington when Eleanor moved. Later, if any of them had survived to tell it, they might have tried to describe what they saw. But language fails at moments like these, when motion becomes too fast for the eye to track, when the impossible becomes brutally, lethally real. Eleanor's draw was a blur of motion that seemed to occupy no time at all, as if her pistols had simply materialized in her hands, already firing. The sound was a rolling thunder of 3 shots, so close together they almost seemed like one. Frank Dalton's gun had barely cleared his holster when the first bullet took him in the right shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second and third shots came before he hit the ground, and Roy Dalton and Jake Morrison stood frozen, their hands still inches from their weapons, staring at the smoking barrels of Eleanor's Colts. The entire thing had taken perhaps a second and a half. Frank lay in the dirt, clutching his shoulder and howling. The bullet had shattered his collarbone, rendering his gun arm useless. His Remington lay in the dust 3 feet away, never fired. Eleanor stood from a rocking chair, her movements still slow and measured, as if she'd simply decided to stretch her legs rather than having just outdraw 3 armed men. Her pistols remained level, trained now on Roy and Jake, who stood like statues, their faces pale beneath their trailed dust and stubble. "Your friend is alive," Eleanor said, her voice calm and steady. The bullet went through meat and bone, but missed the lung. "He'll live, assuming he gets medical attention and doesn't do anything stupid in the next few minutes." Roy's hand was trembling now, still hovering near his gun, paralyzed by the impossibility of what he'd just witnessed. That ain't possible. Nobody's that fast." "Your brother thought the same thing," Eleanor observed. "Right up until he didn't." Jake Morrison's face had gone from confident to ashen. His gunfighter's pride warred with his survival instinct, and for a long moment, it was unclear which would win. His fingers twitched, and Eleanor's pistols shifted slightly, tracking the movement. "Don't," she said quietly. "I aim for the shoulder because I wanted you boys to leave here alive. You draw me now, and I won't be so charitable." "Who the hell are you?" Jake whispered. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. The past was supposed to stay buried, but perhaps some truths couldn't stay hidden forever. 27 years ago, I was someone else, she said finally. Someone I tried very hard to leave behind. Your bad luck is that some things you never quite forget, no matter how long you try. Roy found his voice, though it came out higher than normal. You're her. You're Ella Quinn. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Frank had stopped moaning and was staring up at Eleanor with new understanding mixing with his pain. Jake's hand moved very carefully away from his guns. Ella Quinn's dead, Eleanor said flatly. Died 27 years ago. I'm just an old widow who wants to be left in peace. You shot my brother, Roy said, but there was no heat in it now, just shock and a dawning realization of how close they'd all come to dying. I shot him because he was stupid enough to draw on me, Eleanor corrected, and because shooting him was kinder than killing him, which is what would have happened if I'd aimed center mass. You boys came here thinking you'd found an easy target. You were wrong. Question now is, are you smart enough to learn from that mistake? Frank had managed to prop himself up on his good arm, his face twisted in pain and fury. "This ain't over, old woman. You can't." The crack of Eleanor's pistol cut him off. The bullet kicked up dirt 2 inches from his hand, and Frank jerked back with a yelp. "That was a warning," Eleanor said, her voice gone cold as a February creek. "The next one won't be. Now here's how this is going to work. Roy, Jake, you're going to help your brother onto his horse. You're going to ride to the doctor in town and get him patched up, and then you're going to ride out of Redemption and never come back. And if we don't?" Jake asked, though his heart clearly wasn't in the challenge. Eleanor's eyes locked onto his, and in them he saw something that made his blood run cold. Not anger or cruelty, but a simple, absolute certainty. The look of someone who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation if necessary. "Then I'll put bullets where they'll do more than hurt," she said simply. "I gave up the gunfighter's life a long time ago, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to end one. You boys want to test whether an old woman can kill 3 men before they can draw? We can find out right now." The silence that followed was broken only by Frank's labored breathing and the distant sound of that crow, still calling its harsh warning to no one in particular. Roy moved first, carefully, his hands well away from his guns. "We're going," he said quietly. "Jake, help me get Frank up." It took 10 minutes to get Frank Dalton onto his horse, and every second of it Eleanor stood on her porch, pistols still in hand, watching with the patient alertness of a shepherd guarding against wolves. The 3 men said nothing more, avoiding her eyes as they might avoid looking directly at the sun. When they finally rode away, Frank swaying in his saddle and clutching his wounded shoulder, Roy and Jake flanking him like defeated soldiers retreating from battle, Eleanor finally allowed herself to lower her guns. The moment the tension released, she felt it, the weight of years, the trembling in her hands that adrenaline had kept at bay, the aching joints that had moved faster than they had in decades. She sank back in her rocking chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 63 years. The guns felt heavier now, laden with memory and meaning. She looked down at them, these old friends that had saved her life more times than she could count, that had ended other lives in service of staying alive herself. For 27 years, they'd been artifacts, relics of a past life, kept clean more out of habit than necessity. Now they were real again, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. The sound of running footsteps made her look up. Half the town was streaming toward her ranch, drawn by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. At the front of the crowd was Sheriff Tom Brennan, a decent man in his 40s who'd held the position for 3 years without major incident. "Mrs. McAllister," he called out, panting as he reached her fence. "We heard shots. Are you all right?" "Did those men?" "I'm fine, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice tired. "They came looking for gold that doesn't exist. I persuaded them to look elsewhere." Brennan's eyes fell on the pistols in her lap, then tracked to the small dark stains in the dirt where Frank Dalton had bled. "You shot one of them?" "Shoulder wound," Eleanor confirmed. "They'll be at Doc Morrison's by now. You might want to check on them, make sure they get patched up, and then escorted out of town." The sheriff looked at her with new eyes, seeing something he'd missed in all the years since she'd arrived in Redemption. "Mrs. McAllister, how did you— I mean, there were 3 of them." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Sheriff, every person has a past. Most of the time, that past is better left buried. But sometimes the world doesn't give you that choice." Martha Hendricks, the seamstress who lived 2 houses down from the general store, pushed through the crowd. She was a stout woman with kind eyes and more courage than sense. "Eleanor, dear, you're shaking. Let me help you inside." "I'm all right, Martha," Eleanor said. But even as she spoke, she realized it wasn't entirely true. The reaction was setting in now, the aftermath of violence that she'd almost forgotten. Not fear. She'd never been afraid in a gunfight. But the cold certainty of what had almost happened, what she'd almost had to do. "You shot a man," Martha said softly, taking Eleanor's arm. "You've got every right to shake. Come on now, let's get you some tea." The sheriff turned to the crowd. "All right, folks, show's over. Mrs. McAllister is fine, and the situation is handled. Go on about your business." As the crowd dispersed, spreading the story in excited whispers that would grow in the telling, Sheriff Brennan lingered. Mrs. McAllister, I'm going to need a statement. About what happened here? Eleanor nodded wearily. Self-defense, Sheriff. 3 armed men threatened me on my own property. I defended myself with appropriate force. You'll find one of them wounded but alive, and the other 2 unharmed. Appropriate force, Brennan repeated, shaking his head in wonder. Ma'am, those are 3 of the meanest gun hands I've seen in years. Jake Morrison's supposed to be lightning fast. How did you? I was faster, Eleanor said simply. Then, after a pause, I wasn't always a widow, Sheriff. Wasn't always old. We've all been young once, and some of us were different people when we were. Understanding dawned slowly on Brennan's face. You were a gunfighter. Long time ago, Eleanor said. Another life. I came here to leave that behind. Did you kill anyone before? In your other life? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the prairie beyond her property, seeing ghosts in the waving grass. Yes, she said finally. Only in fair fights. Only when I had no choice. But yes. The sheriff absorbed this, then nodded slowly. Well, today was a fair fight too, from the sound of it. 3 against 1, and you gave them a chance to leave. That's clear-cut self-defense in any court. They won't press charges, Eleanor said with certainty. Men like that don't admit to being outdrawn by an old woman. They'll leave town and tell everyone they decided the pickings weren't worth the trouble. You seem sure of that. I'm sure of men like them, Eleanor replied. Pride matters more than truth. They'll swallow their shame and move on. Sheriff Brennan touched his hat. I better go check on them anyway. Make sure they get the message about leaving town. He paused. Mrs. McAllister, Eleanor, if you don't mind me asking, what name did you go by before? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, weighing the cost of truth against the relief of no longer hiding. Quinn, she said finally. Ella Quinn. The sheriff's eyes widened. Quick Draw Quinn? The one they wrote dime novels about. Those novels were mostly lies, Eleanor said with a slight smile. Though I suppose today I proved some of them true. After the sheriff left, Martha helped Eleanor inside, settling her in the comfortable chair by the fireplace and bustling about making tea. The older woman's hands had finally stopped shaking, but she felt hollowed out, as if the confrontation had burned through some essential reserve she hadn't known she was carrying. You never told anyone, Martha said gently, bringing over the tea. All these years, and we never knew. That was the point, Eleanor said, accepting the cup gratefully. I wanted to be just Eleanor, just a woman living a quiet life. Was it true what you said? About the gold? Eleanor nodded. Every word. Thomas thought he'd struck it rich, and finding out it was worthless broke something in him. He died disappointed, which breaks my heart more than losing him. I'd give anything to go back and tell him that he was rich in kindness, in decency, in all the ways that actually matter. Martha patted her hand. He knew, dear. Everyone could see how much you two loved each other. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking tea, the afternoon light slanting through the windows and painting the room in shades of amber. 3 days later, Sheriff Brennan returned to Eleanor's ranch with news. The Dalton brothers and Jake Morrison had left town the morning after the shooting, Frank's arm in a sling and all 3 men notably subdued. They'd paid Doc Morrison for the medical care and ridden south without a word to anyone about what had really happened. But something else had happened in those 3 days. The story had spread, as stories do in small towns, growing and changing in each retelling. By now, half of Redemption believed Eleanor had killed all 3 men and buried them in her root cellar. The other half had heard she was Quick Draw Quinn and was arguing about whether the old gunfighter could really be a quiet widow. They're afraid of you now, Brennan said, standing in her doorway, his hat in his hands. Half the town, anyway. Eleanor had expected this. Fear was easier than understanding, and mystery bred speculation. And the other half, curious, excited. Young Tim Parker at the general store asked me if it was true that you once killed 10 men in Dodge City. The sheriff shook his head. I told him that was nonsense, but I'm not sure he believed me. It was 5, Eleanor said dryly. And it was Abilene, not Dodge City. And they drew first. Brennan looked at her uncertainly, unable to tell if she was joking. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. That was a joke, Sheriff. The dime novels made up most of those stories. The truth was never as exciting as people wanted it to be. But there's some truth to them. Some, Eleanor admitted. Enough that I earn a reputation. Enough that I wanted to leave it behind. The sheriff shifted his weight. Mrs. McAllister, I came to ask you something, and you're free to say no. But, well, the town council had a meeting yesterday. With the Dalton gang gone, word's going to spread about what happened here. Other outlaws might hear about it too. You're worried I've painted a target on redemption. Not exactly. Brennan met her eyes. I'm wondering if maybe you've given the town something it didn't have before. A reputation for being tougher than we look. A reason for drifters and troublemakers to think twice before stopping here. Eleanor studied him, understanding dawning. You want me to stay? The council authorized me to offer you a position. Deputy sheriff. Nominal duties. You wouldn't have to do much of anything, really. But your presence, your reputation, it might keep trouble away. It was a generous offer, Eleanor knew. An official position, a small salary, and most importantly, acceptance rather than fear or rejection. But it was also an invitation back into the life she'd tried to leave behind. I'm 63 years old, she said quietly. My hands shake when it's cold. I got lucky 3 days ago. If any of those boys had been truly fast, truly skilled, I might not have been quick enough. But you were quick enough, Brennan pointed out. And sometimes reputation is more powerful than reality. The story of what you did is already making the rounds. Men will hear about the old widow who outdrew 3 gunfighters, and they'll decide to find easier pickings elsewhere. Eleanor walked to her window, looking out at the land she'd called home for over 2 decades. This place had given her peace, anonymity, a chance to be someone other than Quick Draw Quinn. But that peace had been shattered the moment she'd drawn her guns again. What if I say no? She asked. Then nothing changes, Brennan said. You're still Eleanor McAllister, the widow who defended herself. The story will die down eventually, become just another tale people tell. You can go back to your quiet life. Can I, though? Eleanor turned to face him. Once you've been reminded of who you were, can you really go back to pretending you're someone else? The sheriff had no answer for that. That night, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair on the porch, her 2 Colts laid out on a cloth in her lap. She cleaned them slowly, methodically, the old routine coming back like a prayer remembered from childhood. The metal gleamed in the lamplight, and her hands moved with practiced certainty despite their occasional tremor. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd built together, about the woman she'd become in his gentle presence. She thought about Ella Quinn, young and fierce and deadly, drawing her guns against all comers. She thought about the space between those 2 women, the years and choices and compromises that separated them. The truth was, she realized they were both her. Eleanor and Ella. The woman who made quilts and the woman who made widows. You didn't stop being your past just because you built a new future on top of it. The question wasn't whether she could go back to being just Eleanor. The question was whether she wanted to. A sound in the darkness made her look up. A young woman was approaching her fence, moving hesitantly in the moonlight. Eleanor recognized her as Sarah Mitchell, the baker's daughter, no more than 17. Mrs. McAllister, the girl called softly. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I heard what happened. What you did. Eleanor set down her cleaning cloth. Come up on the porch, child. No need to shout. Sarah climbed the steps and stood awkwardly, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. In the lamplight, Eleanor could see a bruise on the girl's cheek, half hidden by her hair. My pa, Sarah said quietly. He drinks. Gets mean. Last night he hurt my mama bad. Sheriff can't do anything. My mama won't press charges, says it's just family business. The girl's eyes met Eleanor's, desperate and determined. But I heard what you did, how you stood up to those men. And I thought maybe you could teach me. Teach you what? How to fight back. How to be strong like you are. Sarah's voice cracked. I'm so tired of being afraid. Of watching my mama be afraid. I want to learn to protect us. Eleanor looked at this girl, seeing echoes of her own younger self. The anger, the desperation, the conviction that violence could solve violence. She remembered being 18 and strapping on her father's guns, certain that strength meant never backing down, never showing fear. She'd been wrong then. Strength was more complicated than that. "Sit down," Eleanor said gently. Sarah perched on the edge of the other rocking chair. "What your father's doing is wrong. What your mother is suffering is wrong. But a gun isn't the answer to that. Then what is?" Sarah's eyes flashed. "Just taking it? Just waiting until he kills her?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Never that. But true strength isn't about outdrawing someone. It's about knowing when to fight and when to find another way. It's about protecting without becoming the thing you're fighting against." She reached out and took the girl's hand. "Tomorrow, you and your mother are going to come to my house. We're going to talk to Sheriff Brennan together, and we're going to find a legal way to keep you both safe. If your mother won't press charges, there are still options. I have room here, and your mother can work for me if she needs independence. The church fund can help. The community can help. But listen to me, Sarah. I've killed 7 men in my life. Every one of them in a fair fight. Every one of them because I had no other choice. And you know what? I still see their faces sometimes. Still wonder if there was something else I could have done. Some way I could have walked away." Eleanor's grip tightened. "Don't be so eager to learn how to kill. Be eager to learn how to live without having to." Sarah was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "I just want to protect her. I know. And we will. Together. The whole town if we have to." Eleanor pulled the girl into a hug. "That's what real strength looks like. Knowing when to ask for help, when to stand together, when to build something better instead of just tearing down what's broken." After Sarah left, with promises to return in the morning with her mother, Eleanor sat back in her rocking chair and picked up her pistols again. She looked at them for a long time, these tools that had shaped so much of her life, these symbols of a past she couldn't quite leave behind. Then she began cleaning them again, but her mind was made up. The next morning, she walked into town and found Sheriff Brennan at his office. "I'll take the position," she told him, "but not as a gunfighter. I'll be your deputy. I'll help keep the peace, but I'm going to do it Eleanor's way, not Ella's way. That means talking before shooting, preventing trouble instead of ending it." Brennan smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, Deputy McAllister." As they shook hands, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, but maybe something better. Acceptance of who she'd been, who she was, and who she might yet become. That afternoon, Sarah Mitchell and her mother came to Eleanor's ranch. The sheriff came too, and by evening, arrangements had been made. The town rallied around the Mitchells with the fierce protectiveness of people who'd been reminded that strength comes in many forms. And on her porch, in her rocking chair, Deputy Eleanor McAllister sat with her guns cleaned and holstered, ready but not eager, capable but not cruel. The old widow who had outdrawn 3 men before they could touch their guns, proving that the deadliest weapon isn't always the one you carry. Sometimes it's simply knowing who you are, what you stand for, and when mercy is stronger than violence. The sun set over redemption, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And for the first time in 3 days, Eleanor felt like she could breathe freely again. She was Eleanor. She was Ella. She was both, and neither, something new built from the pieces of who she'd been. And that, she thought, was enough. The end.